Bloodborne is one of my favorite games of all time. It's the game that got me into the Souls games. I remember back when it came out in 2015, I was watching a playthrough by a guy called Epic Name Bro. I just loved what I was seeing. Unfortunately for me, I did not have a PS5 at the time and wouldn't for a while, so I did the next best thing and bought Dark Souls 1. Anyway, enough about all that. Bloodborne is a gothic slash cosmic horror game by From Software, the same people who made the Souls games and Elden Ring, and I personally think it's their best creation. Now, in many ways, a game like Sekiro or Elden Ring are better. However, I just think the Bloodborne is such a perfectly realized vision that it's hard not to fall in love with the game. Now, before we can get into the story of Bloodborne itself, there's a lot of backstory that needs to be established. To begin, there was this ancient civilization called the Tumerians. Now, not that much is known about them, but at some point their civilization fell, and they retreated into these vast underground labyrinths that we can explore in-game. These are called the Chalice Dungeons. Some of them, anyways. Chalice Dungeons are... We'll talk about them later, but Temerians were closely connected to these cosmic entities called Great Ones. These things are basically alien gods. The Temerians were both their worshippers and protectors, but at some point the Great Ones ascended from the earth. Most of them anyway, but we'll talk about that later. Now the Temerians kind of have supernatural powers due to their connection with the Great Ones, so I think it's not far-fetched to say their civilization started to decline when the Great Ones left the earth. A long time later, the town of Yharnam was built over the top of the old labyrinths. Now, Yharnam was the name of the Tumerian queen, so maybe Tumerian descendants founded the town. Just outside town was the College of Byrgenwerth. Now, this college housed all the brightest minds in Yharnam, most importantly, Master Willem and his student Lawrence. Eventually, the scholars at Byrgenwerth discovered an entrance to the old Tumerian labyrinth and discovered the existence of the Great Ones. As Byrgenwerth studied the Great Ones, they learned of the seemingly magical properties of the old blood, the blood of Great Ones and their lesser kin. It's basically a panacea, can cure all illnesses, wounds, and probably makes you high as shit too. Master Willem, though, believed that the blood was dangerous and that they should fear it. Lawrence did not hold that view. Willem basically believed that to reach enlightenment and more or less become a Great One, you had to line your brain with eyes, to think like a Great One. Now there's a mechanic in game called Insight, which kind of sounds like insight, as in eyes on the inside of your brain, so that may be literal. Having a higher insight also allows you to see things you can't otherwise, like certain enemies, so Willem is right in a sense. Lawrence, however, believed that the only way humanity could ascend was by using the old blood. So he left Byrgenwerth for Yharnam to found the Healing Church. The church administered this blood to all who needed it. Like I said, it can basically heal anything. Now, as you can imagine, the blood of alien gods is kind of rare, so the church started mixing it with human blood for their administrations. This had the unfortunate side effect of turning some people into hideous beasts. At the time of the game, you struggle to even find a Yharnamite who isn't strangely tall and hairy, so I'd say it's a pretty common side effect. Now, the church was able to contain this for a while through organizations like the Black Church Hunters, kind of like the Spanish Inquisition. They would find and kill potential beasts before they turned. If they couldn't contain it, though, they enlisted the help of freelance hunters to kill the beasts. We later learn of a faction called the League, who are all about that shit. Now, if things get really out of hand, they basically make it a national holiday to go out and kill the beasts. It's called the Night of the Hunt, where all able-bodied men go out and kill every single slightly beastly thing they can find, and also kill outsiders. Now, once already, things got too out of hand. There was this strange plague that went around called Ashen Blood. No normal antidotes could cure it, so we can assume that the people turned again to blood ministration. The blood didn't cure it either, though, but this uptick in blood use led to a huge beast scourge. This got so bad that the church eventually decided to burn the city down and condemn the entire section of the city. This is now called Old Yharnam. We visit here later, but the game begins in New Yharnam, of course just called Yharnam. Our player came to the city seeking blood healing for some unknown sickness. We're looking for something called the Pale Blood, which can apparently cure us. Nothing is free in this world though, so we sign a contract to become a hunter for the city, getting our first blood transfusion in the process. We also trip out the entire time and see these little skeleton guys kill a werewolf, then crawl all over us. It's weird as fuck. After that, we exit the operation room and get immediately mauled to death by a werewolf. Rather than being dead though, we come to in the Hunter's Dream, this foggy but kinda nice mansion that will serve as our hub for the game. Inside this dream we find the doll, who serves as our level up girl, and also this old man in a wheelchair named Gehrman. He's a little weird, but chill.
We don't have as many tools as we once did, but you're welcome to use whatever you find. Even the doll, should it please you.
We can then exit the Hunter's Dream and go back to the real world where we chat with this nurse named Yosefka. She refuses to open her door for us, but gives us a vial of her blood. It's a weird way to flirt, but whatever. We then emerge into the town of Yarnum on a night of the hunt, and apparently we're not tall or hairy enough to fit in with the town because the citizens start attacking us. We get word from this guy hiding in a house that we should look for pale blood at the healing church, so that's where we're headed. We see the real effect of this hunt when we go into this main street. Up and down the street we see burning beasts, and there's an absolute horde of Yarnumites. These guys are assholes though, and don't let this poor ogre pass the gate, so we kill them. I don't know why, but I kind of find these ogre guys cute, like he's just banging on the door trying to join the party. Makes me feel bad. We also see these guys just chilling with crows and dogs and stuff throughout the game, so I don't know how you can not like them. In this first section, we fight our first boss, the Cleric Beast, a church member who turned into a beast. He's pretty easy though, and we can move on to the sewers. These sewers are where we can find some even more beastly townfolk, as well as these living corpses. Now, I don't think there's a lore explanation for this, but we do find more undead in the Tumerian labyrinths, so maybe it's just a thing in this world. Emerging from the sewers, we can talk to this young girl who tells us that her dad is out hunting and her mom went to go look for him. Neither have returned, so she gives us a music box that apparently helps calm her dad down while he's hunting. Her dad turns out to be the next boss, Father Gascoigne. He killed his wife in a fit of bloodlust and is now trying to kill us. We found him cutting up a dead Yarnumite, and his whole reason for fighting us is simply that he knows that eventually we'll become a beast. Gascoigne was one of these black church hunters, although it seems now he's more of a freelancer. Halfway through the fight, he transforms into a full-on beast. We can play that music box his daughter gave us to momentarily calm him down. After defeating him, he drops the key to Odin Chapel. Maybe the church had Gascoigne here to prevent entry to the cathedral from Lower Yarnum. Anyway, we can find a red brooch on his wife's body. Now giving this to his daughter will result in her leaving her house and getting eaten by a pig, so maybe don't do that. Using the key from Gascoigne, we enter Odin Chapel, where this weird dude asks us to direct people here. The incense here apparently keeps the beasts away. Despite how suspicious this guy is, it is actually safe here. At least unless we direct a certain person here, he comes in later. There's this old lady and rude guy you can direct here, as well as a nun and prostitute later on. I forgot to grab most of these NPCs, but you definitely can get a whole little group going here. You also find Eileen the Crow here, who's a hunter of hunters. She's a fan-favorite character, but if you progress her questline enough, she dies to the super unfair hunter called the Bloody Crow of Canehurst. There's a lot of other NPC interactions in the game, like for example, both the nun and prostitute will give you blood, and if you take the prostitutes more often than the nun, she will eventually become all jealous and kill the prostitute. I'm not going to talk about all of them though, mainly because I forgot to do most of them, and we need to move on with the story. We are now in Upper Yarnum, and rather than fighting peasants with farming tools, we're fighting church servants and these giants. I don't know what the story is with these giants, kind of like the undead giants in the Tumerian labyrinths. They just kind of exist in this world. There's church giants, undead giants, and even shark giants later on. The church servants consist of a few wearing the black hunter clothes mentioned before, who wield whole-ass crosses against you, and mostly ones wearing white church garbs. Now, I don't think that these are actually church hunters, because we fight multiple of them later on and they're more or less just normal humans. These guys are these pale, emotionless giants who just kind of groan when they see you. Now, these guys look a lot like Tumerians, which we can encounter later, so the church might have found some way to enslave them. That's what the wiki says, but to be honest, the Tumerians and the tombs don't seem like they're all there anyway, so they probably just had to hand them cool outfits and weapons and the Tumerians didn't object. Now, Upper Yarnum branches off into many other areas, but let's begin with Old Yarnum. We ignore a warning on a door because we can't read, and enter the quarantine city only to be met by the voice of another hunter. This is Dejura, a hunter from a group called the Powder Kegs, who were at some point branded as heretics by the Hunter's Workshop. We can find this workshop in Upper Yarnum and get access to some amazing weapons like Ludwig's Holy Blade. Hidden away in this super annoying platforming section, you can also find the Hidden Workshop, which looks exactly like the Hunter's Dream. You can even find a set of doll's clothes and a hairpin here. This is where Gehrman worked before he was an old man stuck in a dream. Now, Gehrman was basically the founding member of the Hunter's Workshop. Their weapons and armor are based on his designs. Through hidden dialogue while Gehrman is sleeping, we can hear him begging to be let go from the Hunter's Dream. He seems to be trapped here. Why? Well, we'll learn more about that later. The last thing to note is that we find 1/3 of a Great One's umbilical cord here, and I will not elaborate on that until later. Dejura tells us that there's no reason for us to be here and to leave the beasts alone. That might be surprising to hear a hunter say, but it's pretty true. The beasts here pose no threat to the rest of the city, and most are sickly and dying anyway. If we ignore the old man and proceed into the city, killing his beasts, he guns our ass down with a Gatling gun. Working our way through the city, we can eventually kill Dejura and this other powder keg, and proceed into the rest of the city. As you would guess, the city is overrun with beasts, the pinnacle of which is the boss, Blood-Starved Beast. I've always really liked this boss just because of how goofy his hood looks as it's flapping around the entire fight. Killing the poisonous beast, we get our first chalice, which allows us to access the chalice dungeons. We'll talk more about the chalice dungeons much later. Interestingly enough, Old Yarnum connects directly to a place called Yahar Ghul, but we can't get there from here. How do we get there then? Well, around the corner of Udin Chapel, you can find this giant with a bloody bag over his shoulder. These are called body snatchers, and dying to this one results in you waking up in a prison cell in the hidden city, Yahar Ghul. Now, Yahar Ghul becomes a lot more important later, but right now we only have access to this area called the Hypogean Jail. It's an area where you can do all kinds of fun stuff, like get one-shot by body snatchers, mauled by dogs, get your eyes carved out by witches, and die to the boss Dark Beast Parl. Parl is a type of enemy lovingly referred to by the community as a camera beast. Why is that? Well, it's because literally half the difficulty of the fight is fighting the camera to try to see what he's doing. Literally 90% of the difficulty here is due to you not being able to see anything that Parl is doing. Now you can struggle your way into killing the electric beast here, or wait until we come back to this area later. Either way, you can open a door that leads directly to Old Yarnum. Now we'll talk more about Yahar Ghul later. Another area that branches off from Central Yarnum is Hemwick Charnel Lane, a super metal name for a place. Now this place is populated almost entirely by women, the only exception being the lovable ogres and the giant executioners. This place is run by the Witches of Hemwick, these strange old hags who cover themselves with eyes stolen from their victims. Now, how is it that a place like this can operate right outside of Yarnum? Well, it's because it's sanctioned by a branch of the church called the School of Mensis. Hemwick Charnel Lane is more or less a giant cemetery for the victims of this school. We'll talk more about the School of Mensis later, but basically bodies were sent here, their eyes were taken by the witches, then their bodies were burned into ash and used by hunters to strengthen their bullets. The boss here is the Witches of Hemwick. Now they stay invisible the entire fight and will revive each other if you don't kill them fast enough. The real danger in this fight are these shadowy enemies that will spawn around the arena, and actually the whole area of Hemwick Charnel Lane. How many of these things you have to fight depends entirely on your insight. More insight means more of them spawn. If you have no insight, then none of them spawn. This is a great demonstration of the saying, ignorance is bliss. The witches are basically helpless if a complete buffoon comes in to fight them. Now there are way more areas that branch off from Central Yarnum, but for now let's go back and fight the area's boss, Vicar Amelia, another church official turned beast. The Vicar isn't a particularly hard fight if you know what you're doing, and after beating her we find the now very beastly skull of Lawrence, the man who founded the Healing Church. Touching his skull grants us a vision of a memory, the moment where he left Byrgenwerth and spurned Willem's design.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood.
Here we learn Willem's favorite saying, fear the old blood, which just so happens to be the password for a door leading outside the city. We now find ourselves in the Forbidden Woods, an area crawling with hunters and beasts alike. Also, it's important to mention that by this time the church allows no one to visit Byrgenwerth, its forbidden ground. We'll find out why they did this later. We venture through the Forbidden Woods and there's two important NPCs to find here. One is this crackhead who asks you to find him a safe place to stay. If you ignore all the obvious red flags about him and tell him about Udin Chapel, he'll go there and kill a couple of the NPCs you had there. Not recommended because some of the NPCs are very important. You can also then fight him after, and he turns full beast and he's actually kind of tough. The second, and more important NPC is this mysterious voice who gives us an item called the Tonsil Stone. He tells us that we should step around the side of the cathedral if we want to have a little fun. Doing just that and standing in this little offering bowl results in this gigantic hidden spider creature grabbing and teleporting us to a new area after a cutscene where this guy seems a little too happy about it.
Oh, Amygdala. Oh, Amygdala. Have mercy on the poor bastard.
We wake up in a lecture hall filled with slimes. We can find the guy who gave us the tonsil stone here hiding behind a door. He's kind of a spider creature. He seemed to want to sacrifice us to this amygdala. Exiting the lecture hall, we emerge into the Nightmare Frontier, an area with a very cool visual design and also one of two poison swamps in the game. The Nightmare Frontier is interesting because the whole area is a PvP zone where you can get invaded and it has some very unique enemies like the Yetis. In the latter part of the arena, we also get introduced to the Winter Lanterns. These really cool enemies visually, and I love the haunting song they sing. However, they're super annoying. They inflict you with frenzy, which will build up and cause massive damage unless you take a sedative. Past the Winter Lanterns, we find Amygdala herself. It's a very cool fight visually. Most of the difficulty comes from the fact that you have to hit the spider's arms to do any damage, and they're kinda hard to hit. That gets even worse when halfway through, Amygdala rips two of her own arms off to use as weapons against you. Beating her doesn't really reward you with that much. This was a completely optional area, but what is this mysterious being? Well, all around Yharnam we can find statues of Amygdala, so clearly the church knows and probably worships them. By the way, there are way more than just one of these things, but that'll come in later. We know that Amygdala are great ones, although lesser great ones than some we'll learn of later. I think Amygdalas are probably attracted to areas with Great One influence. It could also be that they're almost like angels in Christian mythology, where they're servants and messengers for bigger, more powerful Great Ones. This Amygdala in particular seemed to demand human sacrifices from its follower, Patches the Spider, the guy who sent us here with the Tonsil Stone. We'll see more of these guys later, but for now let's continue through the Forbidden Woods. The Forbidden Woods is also home to the other poison swamp in the game. Heading through the swamp leads you all the way back to the starting clinic of the game, Yusefka's. Now, at a certain point, you can talk to Yusefka, and rather than giving you blood, she'll ask that you send people here as a safe place. If you do that, you'll find anyone you sent here turned into these small blue celestial aliens. It's important to mention that the nice nurse we met at the beginning has been replaced. You can actually see it happen through the cracks of the door. This new Yusefka seems to have been experimenting on her patients. If you come here before beating the boss at Bergenworth, Yusefka will tell you to turn back or fight her, and it's actually a pretty tough fight. You should absolutely turn back though, as the rewards for coming back later are much better. So we'll be back. Proceeding through the Forbidden Woods, we eventually find the hunters replaced by a shitload of snakes. Giant piles of snakes, guys with snakes as heads, it's very unpleasant. Through a shortcut in the area we can find Voltaire, a guy who lets you join the League of Hunters. They're basically just an organization of independent hunters who agree to help each other out whenever they get the chance. It's mostly just a multiplayer faction, don't really worry about it. Now, working through the snake-ridden forest, we eventually find many more of those little blue aliens we found in Yusefka's. We'll talk more about this enemy type later, but it's at this point that the game switches almost completely from gothic werewolf horror to cosmic horror. The area boss here are the Shadows of Yharnam, three kind of annoying enemies that halfway through the fight grow snakes out of their heads. These guys are Tumerians who were put here to guard the entrance to Bergenworth. Killing them, we get access to the school and find that it's no Hogwarts. Most of the students have been turned into these insect-like enemies called Gardens of Eyes, a sick name for the former Ivy League students. We also find one of these celestial centipedes here, an enemy that looks a lot like the Gaping Dragon from Dark Souls. My guess is that these things just kind of appear wherever cosmic powers are being invoked. You can find them all over the Chalice dungeons, and we know that Tumerians were messing around with this stuff. Or it could be that the students of Bergenworth intentionally summoned it, I'm not sure. Inside we find a member of the choir, a branch of the church that considers themselves the successors to the scholars at Bergenworth. We'll learn more about them later. Moving through the school, we can find Master Willem himself sitting in a wheelchair on a balcony. He has a blindfold covering his eyes. One of his main beliefs is that you have to cover your physical eyes and see from your eyes on the inside to really think like a Great One. Apparently he's been sitting here so long he has mushrooms growing on his back. He doesn't speak to us, only pointing out to the lake. If we jump to this lake, we don't drown, but instead get transported into this dreamlike realm where we fight Rom, the vacuous spider. Now, Rom looks a little like an Amygdala, but rather than being giant and lanky, she's kind of just plump. I remember when I first played this game, this fight had me stuck for days, but it's not that hard when you know what you're doing. Just watch out for her spells. Now, what is Rom? Well, just like Amygdala, she's a Great One, although she's kin to a Great One. What does that mean? Well, Great Ones are born, not made. Kin to Great Ones are beings that have ascended to near Great One status, although they can never be true Great Ones. Rom was ascended to Great One status by the students of Bergenworth. After killing her, we get a glimpse of a crying woman with blood all over her stomach. Approaching her, we see a blood moon descend onto the lake, then we're yanked out of the moonlit lake and find ourselves back in Yharnam. Except something's not quite right. And when I say something, I mean everything. The sky is now lit by a blood-red moon, and we can see a shitload of Amygdalas lurking on almost every rooftop. Now, you can actually see these before killing Rom if you have enough insight, but it's fair to say that 99.9% of Yharnamites had no idea of the giant spider creatures covering their city. Rom was created by Willem to hide the truths of the world from the general public. Willem apparently achieved sufficient insight to see how truly fucked the world was and how the Great Ones shouldn't be trifled with. He tried to hide this from the rest of the world, but as we'll see in a bit, he only succeeded in letting the church cover up their actions. We're now back in Yahar Ghul, the unseen village. Except rather than being in the relatively chill Hypogean jail, we're now getting fucked constantly by swarms of respawning enemies, and Amygdala is blasting us with lasers. The main enemy type here are these bell-ringing women who will summon endless Yarnamites until you kill them. By far the hardest part of this area, though, is when you reach the Hypogean jail and get jumped by 3 Yahar Ghul hunters at once. It's absolutely fucked. But after clearing them, we emerge into what you think would be a familiar area. Before we proceed, let's talk about what happened here. So remember back at the start of the game where all we know is that we're supposed to seek Pale Blood? Well, the moon here is called the Pale Blood Moon, and by killing Rom, we've uncovered a grand ritual that's been taking place to summon it. Who's been doing that ritual? Well, remember the School of Mensis, the faction of the church who used Hemwick Charnel Lane as a crematorium? Well, now we know why they were generating so many bodies. Using the Temerian body snatchers to kidnap Yarnamites and bring them to Yahar Ghul, they performed insane rituals to try to create their own Great One. As we proceed out from the Hypogean jail, we can see the results of these experiments. Giant mounds of flesh and beasts made from stitched together parts roam the streets. The bell-ringing women also show the results of these experiments by being able to revive armies of Yarnamites at their will. It seems like the School of Mensis believed that by combining enough humans physically and mentally, they could create their own Great One. At the end of Yahar Ghul, we see the ultimate culmination of their experiments, the One Reborn, a giant mass of corpses stuck together into a pseudo-Great One. Fighting the One Reborn involves killing the 6 bell-ringing women who buff it, then fighting the beast itself. It's not super hard, but he can get you if you're not careful. After killing him, we find the remnants of the School of Mensis themselves, all of whom are now skeletons trapped within a nightmare. Now, lore on the One Reborn is kind of shoddy in-game, but there's a couple theories. One is that it was made as a body for the newly born Great One Murgo. Now you're probably like, who the fuck is that? Just remember the name for now and we'll talk more about it later. When the One Reborn gets summoned, he falls from a moon-like portal in the sky, which is also important because of later information. Now personally, I think that the One Reborn is the ultimate culmination of the School of Mensis' experiments, and as close as they got to creating their own Great One. I think that by combining hundreds, or maybe even thousands of human bodies and minds together, they were able to create this pseudo-Great One. It's said in-game that the One Reborn can't be considered a Great One. It's not technically a kin either, like Rom. I think that it's as close as humans have gotten to creating their own god. Like I said before, Great Ones are born, not made, so they couldn't truly create a god, but through killing hundreds of thousands of people and calling upon ancient unknowable powers, they created this thing. So congrats, I guess. Unfortunately for them, when you fuck around with eldritch powers, you find out. All of the members of the School of Mensis had their brains fried and were transported into a nightmare of their own making. Hold that thought for now, though, because there's a lot of side content that we need to talk about before we catch up with the Mensis boys. The first of that side content is the Upper Cathedral Ward. Using a key found in Yahar Ghul, we can head to the top of the Hunter's Workshop. Now this is not the dream one or the secret one, just the normal one. At the top is a door that opens up to the Upper Cathedral Ward. This place is populated by some insanely annoying enemies, but right now all we see are these little slug things. As we progress inside, we face a few more church servants as well as blue-eyed werewolves. At one point, 3 of these guys fall through the roof at us. By far the most annoying enemy here, though, is the stupid amount of brain suckers. Brain suckers are these blue tentacle guys who have a stupid amount of damage resistance and do nothing but grab you. Their grabs don't usually kill, but they do steal your insight, literally sucking the intelligence out of your brain. Insight isn't the most common thing either, so this can really suck. They have magic that can stun you, and then they pretty much just spam grab attacks. They are probably the most annoying enemy in any FromSoft game. As for the lore of these guys, they're kin to Great Ones, kind of like Rom, however they're nothing close to being Great Ones in terms of power. In my opinion, these guys are kind of like Amygdalas, or these celestial centipedes. They're attracted to places with Great One influence. You can find a couple of them in Lower Yharnam, but given what we discover in this area a little later, there's a reason why there's so many here. After killing a stupid amount of these blue fuckers, we get a key to unlock a door leading to an orphanage. This orphanage is run by the Choir, the faction of the church focused on researching Great Ones and their influence, much in the same way Willem and Bergenworth did. Inside, we find out just how the Choir has been doing that research, by turning the poor and homeless kids of Yharnam into the blue aliens, and the slug creatures we saw earlier. The same as Yosefka was doing. In fact, the Yosefka imposter was actually a member of the Choir. The boss of the area is the Celestial Emissary, the culmination of the Choir's efforts. It seems like they succeeded in creating a Great One kin, although it's definitely not as powerful as most Great Ones. The Celestial Emissary is just a big version of the little aliens we fought before, but this all begs the question. What's worse, the School of Mensis killing tens of thousands to create a pseudo-great one, or the Choir experimenting on children to create a weak great one? I'll leave it up to you, but this blue fucker is not the only secret the Choir is hiding here. Descending a long elevator shaft, we arrive at the Altar of Despair and see a big blue slug-like figure lurking in the distance. This is Ebrietas, a true, real, and powerful Great One, and the source of the old blood that the Church has been using for so long. Remember how a long time ago I said that the Great Ones ascended and left the planet? Well, a few didn't. Ebrietas was one of them. She was discovered by the Church in the Labyrinth, and it was her blood that led to all this crazy shit that's been happening. So this all begs the question, why would Ebrietas just let these crazy churchgoers farm her for her blood? Isn't she supposed to be this all-powerful godlike entity? Well, the answer is, she's very depressed. All the other Great Ones, assuming we don't count the Chalice Dungeons as canon, which we probably shouldn't, are gone. All the good ones, anyway. It's not like she's gonna have a nice chat with an Amygdala or something. She's the last of her kind, and she's been that way for thousands of years, so she doesn't have it in her to fight back. Even when you first enter her arena, she doesn't turn hostile until you attack her. Now, Ebrietas as a boss fight fucking sucks. The first phase is fine, but in her second, she gets this aura around her that deals constant damage to you. It's insanely annoying. The Altar of Despair itself seems to have a petrified version of Rom the Spider in it. Now, I honestly have no idea what this means. In the Chalice Dungeons, you can find both an extra Rom and Ebrietas to fight, but I think that trying to add the Chalice Dungeons into the canon just kind of fucks everything up, so we'll just ignore all that. The next piece of optional content involves the Vile Bloods, so Gothic horror, right? We've already had the werewolves, now it's time for the vampires. Using a summons we find in Yosefka's clinic, a summons that is actually addressed to us, the player, and that we found on the operating table from the beginning, we go back to Hemwick Charnel Lane. There, a carriage, pulled by two magical horses who can walk on air, takes us to the forbidden Castle Cainhurst. Castle Cainhurst is an ancient place where a once noble family sat and ruled over the surrounding land. That lasted until a Bergenware scholar brought them some kind of corrupted blood from the labyrinth. What made this blood different from the corrupting blood everyone else used isn't really known, but these Cainhurst nobles now became known as Vile Bloods. You should also know that the events I'm talking about happened way before the Healing Church was even fully operational, and anywhere near as influential as they are in modern day. I think it's possible that this corrupted blood was the same thing the Church would later go on to use, they just didn't know it had these effects yet. Anyway, a faction called the Executioners, we can actually meet one of these guys in-game, but the faction has little to no influence anymore. But the Executioners stormed Cainhurst Castle and slaughtered its inhabitants, led by a guy named Logarius. The raid seemingly went very well, and we can only really find a couple of Vile Bloods left, however Logarius stayed behind to let the other Executioners make their escape. Now whether that's actually true or if he just stayed behind because the Vile Blood Queen is really pretty, we'll never know. Anyway, by the time we get to the castle, the only enemies to be found are ghosts. These little butlers, gargoyles because of course, and these disgusting things called blood lickers. These things aren't really related to vampires or anything, they just kinda show up wherever there's a lot of blood. Anyway, venturing through the castle, past all the ghosts, some with slit throats and some who want to slit ours, we make our way to the roof where we can find Martyr Logarius himself. He's a giant of a man who wields a scythe and throws a special kind of magic at you that only these executioners use. This fight can be tough for sure, but after we beat him we get a headpiece called the Crown of Illusions. Putting the crown on reveals a hidden doorway where the Queen of the Vile Bloods resides. If you kneel for her, you can actually join the Vile Bloods. They're a PvP faction. If you don't want to be a simp, though, you can take a letter of invitation from a table nearby and take it back to that executioner we can meet back in Yarnum. His name is Alfred, and he's kind of a psycho. Keep in mind, all this Logarius stuff would have happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but this Alfred guy is just obsessed with avenging Logarius. If you give him the letter, he heads to Cainhurst Castle to find his master. Well, his master is dead, but when he finds the Vile Blood Queen, he literally turns her into a bloody paste on the floor. And when you pick up this paste, the description hints that it'll eventually regenerate back into the Queen, but Alfred, with his mission accomplished, then kills himself back in Yarnum. Now the thing you have to remember about this whole Vile Blood thing is that there really are no good guys in Bloodborne. And the Vile Bloods are a faction that kills hunters for blood dregs, an item only hunters produce when killed. These blood dregs will supposedly eventually result in their queen giving birth to a new Great One. Now that sounds pretty bad, but remember that most, if not all, hunters are blood-crazed fiends who will slaughter everyone in their path. Now the hunters of the League seem pretty chill. Towards other hunters, it's also important to note the hunters serve the Church, which is insanely evil from almost top to bottom. All of this is to say that both the Executioners and Vile Bloods are evil fucks. Moving on from that, let's talk about the DLC, the Old Hunters. Using an item called an Eye of a Blood-Drunk Hunter, we can get grabbed by another Amygdala and sent to the Hunter's Nightmare.
Cursed fiends, their children too. And their children forever true.
This is a place hunters go when they completely lose themselves to bloodlust. There's more to it than that, though, as we can hear someone laying a curse on the hunters and their bloodlines as we're transported in. First area is more or less a recreation of Central Yarnum, and we can find some of these blood-drunk hunters eternally fighting beasts. These guys are tough as shit, but the toughest enemy in these parts are these executioner guards who are just stupid to fight. Anyway, in the church where we initially fought Vicar Emilio, we find this giant flaming beast body as well as an item called the Eye Pendant. There's not much else we can do here yet, though, so we head further into town where we find a literal river of blood littered with both half and fully dead bodies. Now, the thing about the Nightmare Realms, remember the Nightmare Frontier from earlier, now the Hunter's Nightmare, is that they're not just a dream or anything like that. These are whole alternate dimensions hosted by a certain Great One. The Great One hosting this realm, who we'll find later, has personally experienced the brutality of the Church. So this river of blood represents the sheer number of people the Church has killed over the course of years and years of hunting. Of course, in the real world, the Church covered their tracks after each hunt, but this realm, that's not the case. More of these blood lickers patrol the area, and you can even find a whole-ass blood-starved beast in one of the caves. We also find an NPC here who clues us in on what's happening here. He tells us that this is essentially hell for hunters who got lost in blood frenzy, but also that deeper into the nightmare, there's a dark secret that the Church once covered up. He urges us onward. This takes us to a very hard boss fight. All of the bosses here are hard, to be honest, but we're fighting Ludwig, the man who basically created the Church Hunters. We also learn that the river of blood outside isn't just metaphorical. Ludwig killed so many people in this realm to create a flowing river of blood and corpses. The form we find Ludwig in is this giant beastly one that's like a cross between a horse, wolf, and a tentacle monster, but he was once the greatest of all hunters. He had this magical sword imbued with the power of moonlight, and he modeled the weapon I've been using up to this point, Ludwig's Holy Blade, after it. Anyway, Ludwig created the hunters to be honorable Spartans, and even let the general populace join in on a sense. Even during his time, though, some people called him and his hunters blood-crazed degenerates, which of course they are. Halfway through the fight, Ludwig pulls out his Moonlight Greatsword, a weapon that has in some way been in almost all of the Souls games, and the stupidly hard fight goes on. Once we beat him, though, we can talk to his severed head in the blood pile and either tell him that yes, his hunters are honorable warriors, or that they're degenerates.
Have you seen the light? Are my church hunters the honorable Spartans? I hoped they would be. Oh my! Just as I feared. Then a beast-possessed degenerate was I, as my detractors made eminently clear.
If you tell him yes, he'll give you his sword for free, else he'll make a weird neighing sound and you have to kill him for it. Ludwig is the best example of how all hunters are crazed fiends at the end of the day. Even a man with the highest of ideals became a beast so fearsome he drenched the streets in rivers of blood. After defeating Ludwig, we find ourselves in a church prison, then directly into this insane asylum type place. We get backstabbed and jumped by two church hunters, a white and black cloak, then ascend an elevator into the actual floor of the asylum. Now I'm gonna warn you right now, I think this is probably the most fucked up place in the game. Yahar Ghul had shambling mounds of stitched together bodies, and the orphanage had kids turning into aliens, but this part is especially fucked. This area is called the Research Hall. It's populated by these very strange looking enemies. They're wearing hospital gowns, but their heads are these giant sacks of water. The few you can talk to all mention hearing the sounds of water as well. You can find these relatively normal ones, giant ones with no heads, ones that are only a head, and the worst of all, discarded underneath a walkway. You can find a horde of these patients bound in a way that makes them only able to move around by crawling like a caterpillar. The ones that attack you have all gone mad from the torture. The ones that haven't either spout nonsense at you or beg for death.
Kill me. Please. Just kill me. Free me from this place before I go mad.
This is genuinely the most disturbing part of the game for me. The idea that these people were just stuck in these tortured forms for the rest of their lives with no chance of going back just gets to me. I don't know. Many of them will mention a Lady Maria. They all seem to want to please her, in a way. We can find an NPC here named Adeline, who was previously a blood saint, basically a blood donor. She begs us to bring her brain fluid, as it helps her hear the sounds of the water, apparently the goal of these experiments. She says that Lady Maria discouraged her from even becoming a patient, but she insisted. When we give her 2 brain fluids that we got from patients that are just heads, she herself loses her body and becomes just a head. Giving her 1 more dose of her own brain fluid grants her a vision, which gives us the milkweed rune. Equipping the rune turns us into this broccoli-headed thing called a lumen wood. Lumen woods attract phantasms, these little slug things that are always found where great ones have been. It's kind of goofy looking, but I've always liked it. So let's recap a little. The church has been filling people's heads with water and torturing them, but for what reason? Well, at the time, remember the old Hunters DLC shows us a long time before the main game, the church believed that the Great Ones were connected with the ocean. We'll see in a bit that they weren't exactly wrong. Now they filled these people's heads with water to try to get them to hear the words of the Great Ones. These are the water sounds that Adeline was referring to. I can't help but think of when you're a kid and people tell you to hold up a seashell to your ear and you can hear the sounds of the ocean. Enough of that though, clearly this had some effect on not only Adeline, but also these guys out in the courtyard who can throw cosmic magic at us that we haven't seen before. So these experiments were a success then, right? The extreme suffering of all these people was worth something in the end, right? Well, the boss of this area is called Living Failures. These things are failed attempts to make that boss from earlier, the Celestial Emissary. Turns out that turning kids into aliens works better than flooding adults' heads with water. Who would have thunk it? Anyway, after we talk again to that weird guy who kept talking about secrets, he's a former church hunter who grew disillusioned with the church, named Simon. He affirms to us that all of this was the church's doing, but tells us that there's an even worse secret laying beyond the research hall. He tells us to kill Lady Maria at the top of the clock tower to reveal it. After killing the living failures, we ascend the clock tower and find Maria herself. She looks an awful lot like the doll from the dream. She tells us that secrets are best left that way, and tries to stop us from finding whatever lays beyond. This is by far one of my favorite fights in the game. Every human enemy in these games should aspire to be as fun as Maria. Anyway, we kill her, and upon returning to the dream, the doll mentions that she feels like some kind of shackles have been lifted off of her, confirming that she is based off Maria. We can also see the doll crouched at the grave sometimes, the same grave we use to access the DLC areas. I think it's safe to say that this is Maria's grave. For now, all I'll say is that Gammon is more or less the host of this dream. Maria was a student, now that's as far as their relationship went for her, but it's fair to say Gammon wanted more than that. He built a whole doll based off her and even hints sometimes that he uses it for other things than leveling up. We'll learn a little more about Maria later, but after killing her she drops a celestial dial. Hold that thought though, because back in the research hall we find the skull of Lawrence himself hidden under the elevator. Taking the skull back to that massive flaming beast we saw in the chapel reveals that this is Lawrence, now turned into a beast. He's basically just a flaming cleric beast. Now there's some theories that a Chalice dungeon boss called Bloodletting Beast, one of the most annoying bosses in the game in my opinion, is also Lawrence because the injuries on its skull line up. Anyway, enough about that. Lawrence in all his hubris scorned Willem's teachings on meditation to take drugs and be a youth pastor, and this was his reward. Stuck forever as a flaming beast in a nightmare. Halfway through the fight, his legs burn off, and it's super annoying because he just spams one move now. But killing him rewards us with this Beast Embrace rune, which transforms us into this very odd-looking beast form. Cool, now let's get back to that clock tower. Using the dial dropped by Maria, the clock tower opens to reveal a walkway into a muddy, foggy fishing hamlet. Keep in mind this is a nightmare realm, so it's not like in real life the clock tower connected directly to this coastal village. Anyway, the place is in shambles, but as we walk in, we meet a friendly fishman who clues us in on what happened here.
Blood-crazed fiends. Atonement for the wretches by the wrath of Mother Goss. Mercy for the poor wizened child. Mercy. Oh, please. Curse here, curse there. A curse for he and she. White hair. A bottomless curse. A bottomless sea, source of all greatness, all things that be. Listen for the baneful chants. Weep with them as one in trance. And weep with us. Oh, weep with us.
He curses the scholars of Bergenworth as murderers and blood-crazed fiends and curses them, their children, and their children's children forever. He prays for an entity called Cause to lay this curse, and for Cause's child to be given peace. Now what does any of that mean? Well, let's continue into the village and find out. In the village we can find stacks of bodies and one item in particular, the accursed brew. This item is the skull of a local that's had holes poked into it, apparently looking for eyes on the inside. Now who do we know that loves eyes on the inside? We continue into the village where we can find more fishmen and these whale giants. A super annoying enemy, by the way. In a well in the middle of town, there's these two giants. It's one of the hardest fights in the game, but if you beat them, you get the weapon Maria used, the Rakuyo. The description says she cast it into this well when she could no longer bear the sight of it. Apparently the whale ate it. We continue onward, slowly finding more and more phantasms, the slugs that indicate Great One presence. At a waypoint we also find Simon, bleeding out and dying on the floor. He says that the whole reason he came here was to lift the curse. He says it's not fair the hunters have to pay for the sins of their forefathers.
Please, I need you to do something. This village is the true secret. Testament to the old sins. It feeds this hunter's nightmare. Please, bring to an end the horror. So our forefathers sin. We hunters cannot bear their weight forever. It isn't fair. It just isn't fair.
Like I said, this place is kind of like Hunter Hell. His killer was a man named Brador, who we can then fight back in the church prison near where we fought Ludwig. We kill an invader form of Brador, then find him in his cell. Brador was once a great hunter, however after he killed a cleric beast, a former friend of his turned into a beast, he went crazy and started wearing the beast's scalp around. He was locked in this cell, maybe by choice, with a bell that allows him to invade other hunters that are seeking the church's secrets. When we kill him in his cell, the invasions stop. Continuing through the fishing hamlet, we eventually reach an underground area with a ton of these slug women, and later, 2 winter lanterns. Winter lanterns are kind of just Nightmare Realm entities, like the Yetis from the Nightmare Frontier. Anyway, we push further on and find ourselves on a beach overlooked by an ominous pale moon. On this beach is the body of some kind of sea monster. It's like a giant slug and octopus, but with human arms. It's dead though, but out of its body crawls a humanoid creature called the Orphan of Cause. Suddenly a lot starts to make sense. The Orphan is a super formidable fight, very fast and strong for a newborn. He fights with his own placenta, and in his second phase grows wings. After killing him, you can see his soul hovering over his mother's body. So I know I was being a little vague there, but let's talk about what happened here. So in the time before the Healing Church was this all-powerful entity like it is today, Berg and Worth were still some of the main researchers on Great Ones. Willem believed that to ascend was to line your brain with eyes. Willem discovered a fishing hamlet where a dead Great One washed up on the beach. Remember how the church believed the Great Ones were closely connected with the water at the time? Well, not all Great Ones are, but this one definitely is. The locals worship the body of this Great One, which slowly transformed them into fish people, Shadow over Innsmouth style. Willem sends a dispatchment of hunters to investigate. This includes Gehrman, Maria, and maybe Simon, although that's not entirely clear. Now, it's unclear whether this was Willem's purpose or not. I would guess not, but when the hunters arrived, they massacred the civilians, breaking open their skulls to see if there were eyes on the inside. When the hunters got to the beach, they harvested the old blood from Kaz's body, causing her child to be stillborn in the process. As revenge, Kaz cursed all hunters to be trapped in the hunter's nightmare when they lose themselves. Now, we learn in a bit that it was Kaz who ascended Rom the Spider to be akin, so although she's dead in a nightmare, her consciousness might still be around in some way. Anyway, after the massacre, Maria threw her weapon down the well and killed herself, only to wake up trapped in the hunter's nightmare. Gehrman was the leader of this raid, and we know he had a weird obsession with Maria, so he created a doll to cope. Now, why isn't Gehrman here with all the others who raided the village? Well, for now, I'll just say that he sold his soul to another. Alright, now why was Kaz having a baby on the beach? Well, here's a bit of lore that'll be important later. Great Ones are destined to lose their child. We don't know why, but it results in them having children with mortals to be able to actually reproduce. Kaz clearly lost her child here, so that tracks. It also seems like creating a new Great One might require the death of another, so that's why Kaz's body is dead while still having a child. When you destroy the orphan's soul, we get a cutscene saying that he's been freed from this nightmare and returned to the sea, maybe even returned to his mother. I'm not entirely sure if Kaz is completely dead or not, her consciousness might still be out there.
Sweet child of Kos, returned to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be.
Okay, now before we can get back into it, let me briefly discuss the Chalice Dungeons. The Chalice Dungeons are probably the worst piece of content From Software has ever created. They're boring, repetitive, and at a certain point they just decided, how can we make this harder? How about by halving the player's health? They are fucking trash, and I've said it before that trying to fit them into the lore ruins things. Why is that? Well, because they reused bosses that are supposed to be one of one. Why the fuck would there be another ROM in the dungeons? It makes zero sense. There's also another Ebriatus down here. Why? Because they wanted to reuse the fight, obviously. The only explanation for the Chalice Dungeons is that there's some kind of pocket dimensions, which is just stupid and lazy, so I won't even discuss it. There are some genuinely cool fights down here, but overall it's just trash. Anyway, the dungeons culminate with a fight against Queen Yarnum herself. At the time, she was pregnant. Now, this probably isn't canon either that we fought her, but she was also the lady we saw after killing Rom, so it's almost like she was trying to ask for our help there. For what reason, we'll see soon. Alright, that's as much as I'll say about the Chalice Dungeons. Now, remember a long time ago how we were in Yahar'gul. The School of Mensis was kidnapping Yarnumites to use their bodies in rituals in an attempt to create a Great One. They created a false Great One and ended up frying their brains in the process, only to be stuck in a dream. All this ringing a bell? Well, let's go back to Yahar'gul, to that building where we found the school, all dead, and interact with the body of what seems to be their leader. This takes us to the upper floor of that lecture hall we were in earlier, the one that led to the Nightmare Frontier. Here we can catch up with Patches the Spider, and he confirms that he did indeed want to sacrifice us to Amygdala, but that it's all water under the bridge now. Moving on from the lecture hall, we emerge into the Nightmare of Mensis. Now, before we go in, I need to tell you about two other great ones. One of them is Formless Udin, the namesake of Udin Chapel. He seems to be kind of a lesser god to the church, and we don't really know what he does. We do know that he, of course, has no physical form and only communicates with a disembodied voice. We also know that his Carol rune has a connection to quicksilver bullets, obviously used by guns. Guns scale with the skill Blood Tinge, and Udin's rune mention how his followers seek old blood. Maybe he's related to that. Udin also has the strange habit of impregnating unwilling mortal women. He did this to Queen Yarnum, and he does this to both fake Yosefka and the prostitute Ariana in Udin Chapel. He's kind of a weird dude, but remember the Great Ones are destined to lose their child, so maybe he just believes that by crunching the numbers and having as many kids as possible, eventually one will survive. It didn't happen with Queen Yarnum though, as she gave birth to a stillborn named Murgil. We'll come back to this in a bit. The other great one is the Moon Presence. We're getting close to the end of the game, and he's heavily involved in two of the endings. Remember how the One Reborn fell out of a blood-looking moon portal, and how the moon after killing Rom is the same blood moon? This is because the School of Mensa summoned this Moon Presence. I'll elaborate later, but for now you should know that the Moon Presence is kind of the patron god of the hunters. It seems to kind of feed off the violence and blood echoes they create. Okay, keep all of this in mind for just 1 second as we proceed through the Nightmare of Mensis. There's this strange glowing tower in the distance that hits us with frenzy as we approach. It's pretty cool scenery. The enemies here are very similar to those in the Nightmare Frontier. I would venture a guess to say that they're in the same place. We make our way past the average Australian spiders, a choir member, and these weird dudes with iron masks, slowly making our way towards the area boss. As we progress, things start to get weird. Dogs with crow heads, crows with dog heads, spiders with human heads, it's all going crazy. Finally, we arrive at the boss, Mikolash, host of the Nightmare. The boss fight itself is super annoying. You just have to chase him through these foggy corridors until you can catch him at a dead end twice. It's a pretty bad fight, but during it we can hear Mikolash constantly praying to Kaz,
Some say Cosmo.
to grant him eyes and allow him to ascend, apparently just like Rom. Just outside of Mikolash's boss room, we can find a bridge that has 3 winter lanterns on it. Holy fuck. After clearing them, we pull a lever, dropping whatever was in that glowing frenzy tower into the abyss. Traveling via elevator down into this abyss, we can find this massive brain covered with eyes. It looks a lot like the head of the winter lanterns. If we use an emote called Make Contact with it, it gives us the Carol rune. These are kind of the knowledge of the Great Ones inscribed onto runes. This thing is called the Brain of Mensis, and killing it gives us an item called the Living String. The string reveals that this thing is a whole-ass Great One, although a lesser one, probably even lesser than the Amygdalas. The string also describes it as a rotten, evil being. Alright, so what happened here? Well, we know that the School of Mensis was trying to create their own Great One using cosmic powers. This resulted in the One Reborn. The powers they invoked were those of the Moon Presence. This clearly didn't work though, as the One Reborn isn't even akin. Well, not all of their experiments were failures like that. Before they tried to create the One Reborn, the Scholars of Mensis actually managed to reach into the Nightmare Realm and pull out a Great One, the Brain of Mensis. They managed to enslave this thing and essentially use its frenzy-inflicting glare to keep visitors out. As we approach the brain, we can find a myriad of church hunters dead from the brain's attacks. It seems like the church was trying to investigate what the School of Mensis was doing, but this brain stopped them. Anyway, with this newfound success, it seems like the school was trying to invoke Kaz, but she didn't answer, possibly because she's dead. Now remember that the rituals they were performing resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. This probably drew the Moon Presence. Using the moon's power, though, only created the One Reborn, so the school moved on to new ventures. Now this is pretty much just my theory, but I believe that they wanted to move to the Nightmare Realm, maybe because things were getting out of hand with their flesh monsters, or maybe because the rest of the church was getting close to finding out about their rituals. The School of Mensis decided to try to enter the Nightmare of Murgo, the stillborn son of Udin and Queen Yarnum. This fried their brains and killed their physical bodies in the process. I think from here they thought they'd be able to contact Cause easier, but these experiments clearly haven't worked yet, as Mikolash is just a crazy person running around in a maze. Anyway, as we move through the area, we find some more shadows of Yarnum, as well as pigs with a shitload of eyes on them, before finally reaching the boss. We reach this lift and see Queen Yarnum at its feet, crying as she looks at whatever it leads up to. Taking the elevator up, we see a stroller and the sounds of a baby crying, but before we can approach, this massive robed thing appears and attacks us. This is Murgo's wet nurse, another lesser great one. Now keep in mind that Murgo's father was formless Udin, so there's nothing actually in that stroller. In addition to that, Murgo's wet nurse seems to be an invisible creature wearing a robe. Now if you don't know what a wet nurse is, there are women that are paid to breastfeed and take care of someone else's child. Given that, I would guess that Murgo's wet nurse is a lesser great one in service to Udin that takes care of his kids for him. It's also more than capable in battle, so it's definitely supposed to protect Murgo as well. It's not a super hard fight though, and after we kill the wet nurse, Murgo himself slowly passes and the nightmare is over, his consciousness returning to the cosmos. Not only is his nightmare over, but so is ours. When we return to the hunter's dream, everything is on fire and the doll tells us that the hunt is completed and that we should meet Garamond out in the fields. When we meet him in the fields, he gives us a choice. Let ourselves be executed by him and wake up in the morning after the hunt, all is well and the world will be back to normal, or refuse and he'll just kill us the old-fashioned way. If you take him up on his offer, he beheads you and you get the Yarnum sunrise ending. You wake up with no memory of the previous night. Now, it's a fine ending, I guess, if you're a little bitch. You've seen the horrors that the church have committed, but you're just going to forget all that and go live in the world they've created? Now sure, a lot of important church officials are dead. We're told that this hunt was way worse than any of the others, but they'll still continue with their horrific experiments, and this whole thing will eventually happen again. If you refuse Garamond, you have to fight the old man, and he's no pushover. He literally just stands up out of his wheelchair and starts giving you the smoke. Once you defeat the old head though, he seems relieved and we see something coming down from the moon. This is the aforementioned moon presence, the great one running the hunter's dream. Its design is fucking sick and definitely does indicate that this thing feeds off the blood echoes the hunters create for it. The Great One embraces you and you wake up, as the new Garamond. You're now the guy stuck in the dream, guiding other hunters through the moon presence as well. Now before we talk about the secret ending, let's talk more about this being. So like I said, it feeds off blood echoes. When you use the rune Moon, you get more blood echoes. And it runs the hunter's dream to empower hunters to create echoes for it. That's why rather than dying, you wake up here. Why is Garamond here? Well, I think Garamond struck a deal with this thing to avoid his fate in the hunter's nightmare. All who participated in the massacre at the fishing hamlet became stuck in the nightmare. Garamond knew that was his fate as well, so he sold his soul to the moon presence to serve as a guide for other hunters. But why did the hunt end when Murgo died? Well, the reason isn't entirely known, but we know that the reason we're able to exit the dream in the Yarnum sunrise is because the moon presence allows us to. So clearly the moon presence decides when hunts are over. So why did it want Murgo dead? Like I said, it's not entirely known. Maybe he's just petty and was mad the school of Mensis didn't appreciate his gifts. It could also be that he feared that if the night continued and the rituals of the school went on, that the entirety of Yarnum would be destroyed. This guy feeds off blood echo, so he'd rather the city continue to have these massive destructive hunts every once in a while to ensure he keeps his power. The entire city dying would mean he'd lose the whole institution of hunters that he's helped build, and lose this endless supply of blood. Anyway, there's a third ending. A long time ago I mentioned that you could find a third of a Great One umbilical cord in the secret Hunter's Workshop. Well, you can find 3 more of these, 2 from Udin's victims, Yosefka and Ariane, and 1 that you get after beating Murgo's wet nurse. These are exactly what they sound like, but when you eat 3/3 of an umbilical cord, something changes. After you beat Garamond, when the moon presence goes to grab you, he gets repelled. Enraged, he opts to kill you instead. He's really not that hard of a fight. Garamond is much harder. I actually beat him right after fighting Garamond. Now you would guess that if he killed you, he would just make you wake up in Yarnum, but at this point you're basically a Great One in training, so it's likely he doesn't have the power to. When you finally beat him, you wake up as a baby squid. Having truly ascended and become a Great One, the doll will raise you now and you can start to shape the world as you see fit. And this begs the question, how were we able to become a Great One when the church wasn't? Well, I mentioned earlier that to become a Great One, you might need to kill a Great One in the process. Cause might have died so that her baby could be born, and in the same way, we just killed the Moon Presence, one of the most powerful of the Great Ones, and now we have become one. So not only did the church not have the 3 umbilical cords, they also would have had to kill their blood supply, Ebrietas, which of course they never would have done. So that's the story of Bloodborne. Very long and complex, and I probably got a few things wrong, but it's one of my favorite stories in video games. There's this joke that FromSoft themselves don't even know the story of their games, and I think that in the case of Bloodborne, that really may be true. Thank you all so much for watching.